Catherine Bennett had never once opened a car door for herself. But that morning, when her private driver vanished in the middle of a schedule leak, the only replacement sent was a temporary hire in a plain button-down shirt, arriving alongside a small, quiet little girl. Julian Cross took the keys, said almost nothing, and looked at Catherine with eyes far too steady for a man in his position. 3 hours later, he steered her clear of a tale that her entire security detail had missed. That evening, a classified file was pulled open, and the room went dead silent when his name appeared. Find out why a temporary driver left both a CEO and a boardroom speechless stay until the very end. Catherine Bennett ran the kind of company that moved at the speed of money. Her firm, Vertex Transit Technologies, was a logistics and transportation platform operating at the intersection of infrastructure and innovation. Every quarter brought pressure from shareholders, and every board meeting was a chess match she was never sure she would survive. But she had survived them all. That was the point. She was 32 years old, sharp in the way that came from being cut too many times, and composed in the way that came from never being allowed to fall apart. Her office occupied the top floor of a glass tower in downtown Chicago, and from behind her desk, the city looked like something she owned. She did not own it, of course, but she understood the value of appearances. This particular morning had started the way every morning. Did the alert at 5:45, the 6 a.m. Briefing with Grace Nolan, her executive assistant, a calendar packed with no room for uncertainty. The day held 4 meetings, 2 of them critical. The most important was a preliminary conversation with Marchfield Capital, the institutional investment group whose partnership would give Vertex the runway to survive the next 18 months without surrendering its independence. If the deal went through, thousands of jobs were protected. If it fell apart, the board would use the failure to force a sale to Scarlett Vaughn's acquisition group, a cold-blooded operation that collected distressed companies the way other people collected debts. The leak had been discovered at 6:14 a.m. A gossip publication had somehow obtained the precise arrival window for Catherine's car at the Marchfield building. A photographer had been dispatched. A rival investor, one close to Scarlett's orbit, had rearranged his morning to be seen coincidentally in the same block, and a member of Catherine's own staff had apparently passed along a schedule that was only ever distributed on a secure internal channel. Catherine had stood in her office reading the alert, and the calm she wore like armor had not cracked, but her jaw had tightened, and that was enough for Grace to know. The problem compounded itself within the hour. Her regular driver called in at 6:50 to say he was stepping away from the role indefinitely. No real explanation, no real notice. In a single morning, someone had leaked her movements, spooked her driver, and opened a gap in her security routine that felt far too precise to be coincidence. Grace had scrambled. A premium executive transport firm had been recommended through a contact, and a replacement had been sourced. Catherine had been told only that the driver had strong credentials and full background clearance. She had not been told anything else about him. Not his name, not where he came from, not why he was available at 40 minutes' notice on a Tuesday morning. She rode the elevator down to the lobby, already dressed for war charcoal blazer, heels as precise as punctuation, a phone in each hand. She had every intention of making whoever showed up in that car understand exactly where they stood in the order of things. She stepped into the lobby and headed for the exit. The man standing beside the vehicle did not look like someone who was waiting to be instructed on where he stood. He was lean and composed in the way that suggested habit rather than effort. His clothes were clean and well-fitted, without being expensive dark slacks, a white shirt with the sleeves rolled to the forearm, shoes maintained rather than new. He wore a plain watch that hadn't been bought in this decade. None of it was wrong. It was the eyes that were the problem. They swept the street in a single pass left, building entrance, rooftop line, vehicles at the curb, and then settled on Catherine with a steadiness that had nothing apologetic in it. He did not smile reflexively the way people usually did when they first encountered her authority. He simply looked at her, nodded once, and said his name. Julian Cross. That was all. No elaboration, no deference. He turned, checked the rear passenger door mechanism with 2 fingers, and then held it open. Catherine stepped in. She said nothing. What she had noticed in those first seconds, though she would not have admitted noticing anything, was that before coming to the car, he had paused at the glass facade, not to look at himself, but at the street behind him. The reflection gave him a clean read on traffic without turning his head. It was a small motion, entirely unremarkable to anyone not paying attention. She had also noticed the child. The little girl was perhaps 6 years old, with dark braids and a small backpack shaped like a fox. She sat on a lobby bench with feet swinging above the floor, patient the way children are, only when they have been asked to be patient many times before. Julian had arrived before his childcare arrangement came through. He had brought his daughter rather than arrive late. Catherine had looked at the child for 2 seconds and formed her conclusion. A man who brought his daughter to a first day on a job of this caliber was a man who had not organized his life adequately, and a man who had not organized his life adequately was a liability she did not have room for today, of all days. What the lobby cameras could not record was what Julian did before he left. He walked back to Ellie, crouched to her level, and spoke in a low and measured tone, telling her exactly what she needed to do and exactly who would come for her. The child listened with the gravity of someone being trusted, not managed. Then he stood, held her gaze for a moment, and walked out. Catherine had seen it through the glass. She had not let her expression change. In the car, Julian checked the rearview mirror before pulling from the curb, but his eyes did not seek approval. They moved across her briefly, swept to the street, then settled further out as if confirming something he had already decided to look for. They had not been moving for 4 minutes before Julian indicated and eased toward a side street. Catherine looked up from her phone. The route is confirmed through the main corridor. Grace sent it this morning. I know, Julian said. There are 2 people positioned half a block ahead of the main entrance. One with a camera, one without one. The one without worries me more. Catherine did not immediately respond. She was not the kind of person who responded immediately to things she could not verify. You have been in this car for 4 minutes. 3.5, he said, without humor. I noted the vehicle in my mirror leaving the garage. They have matched our speed twice through 2 lane transitions. If we continue on the main route, whoever is waiting at the front will have exactly the kind of photograph that ends up getting cropped and recontextualized before noon. She looked at him in the rearview mirror. He was not looking back at her. He was watching the road with a particular attentiveness of someone who had learned to read traffic the way other people read a page. Pull the alternate through Meridian, she said finally, her voice flat. It was not a concession. It was a tactical decision. She told herself that clearly. Grace sent the update confirming the photographers at that intersection 6 minutes later. Catherine read it, placed the phone face down on the seat beside her, and said nothing. Julian did not point out that he had been right. He simply drove. That was the second thing she noticed about him. Their first real exchange came 20 minutes in, after she had taken 2 calls. She had put the phone down when Julian said, without turning, that the security lead at her destination tended to position the drop-off in a spot with a blind side. He recommended the service entrance for arrival. She stared at the back of his head. How do you know the security configuration at a private investment building? I have been there before, he said. He did not elaborate. She did not ask again, but she filed it. There was a quality to Julian Cross that Catherine found difficult to categorize. He spoke rarely and with compression, as if he had decided in advance what was worth saying and discarded the rest. He did not fill silence with conversation the way most people did. He existed in the space of the car with a self-sufficiency that suggested he did not require her attention in order to feel adequate. It was, she realized with some irritation, a quality she had spent years cultivating in herself. After the second meeting, stepping back to the car, she glanced through the window before opening the door and saw Julian in the front seat with a video call open. Ellie's voice, thin through the speaker, reporting about lunch in the Fox backpack. Julian's voice answering lower than his professional register, slower, the compression entirely gone. He asked if she had worn the cardigan. He reminded her that pickup would be a few minutes late, and that she should wait inside. Catherine got in. Julian ended the call, and neither of them said anything. But she had seen the two registers, the managed economy he used with everyone else, and the unhurried completeness he gave to his daughter, and could not stop filing them as different people. The dinner meeting with Marchfield's lead representative was not on the public calendar. It had been arranged through an intermediary, communicated only through encrypted message, and kept off every standard scheduling system at the company. Catherine had told 3 people about it: Grace, her legal counsel, and Ryan Holloway, the CFO who was coordinating the financial documentation for the deal. Julian arrived for pickup 20 minutes early and spent 15 of those minutes outside the vehicle. Catherine watched from the building's side entrance as he moved along the exterior of the car, with what looked at first like the routine inspection of a careful driver. But the way he knelt beside the rear wheel well, and the way his hand came back empty and then remained still for a moment, longer than it needed to, told a different story. She did not go out. She watched him finish and walk back to his position by the door, without his expression having changed at all. They had been driving for 11 minutes, when the dark SUV appeared 3 cars back. It maintained a consistent interval through 2 lane changes, 1 traffic signal, and a route variation that Julian had not announced. Catherine was on a call with Grace and heard the shift in the engine note before she understood what was happening. Julian said quietly, "Don't look back." He took an exit she didn't recognize, moved through a residential block, slowed briefly at the entrance to a parking structure, then continued without entering. 2 minutes later, he emerged onto a parallel avenue 3 blocks east of their original heading. He sent a message one-handed, precisely, and told her it had gone to Grace. The SUV was gone. Instead of gratitude, Catherine felt suspicion. A temporary driver with no notable history had just handled a vehicle tail the way people who were trained specifically to handle vehicle tails handled them. She asked herself, who was he really, and what was his actual reason for being here? The closer she looked, the less the clean file felt like innocence, and the more it felt like design. The dinner went ahead. The Marchfield meeting was productive enough to suggest the deal was still viable, still within reach. But Catherine sat through it with part of her mind running a different calculation entirely. She had instructed Grace before the car arrived to pull everything available: the transport firm, Julian's documentation, his employment history, his previous roles. What came back was thorough and completely unremarkable. 4 years driving private clients at the executive level, 2 references from high-net-worth households in the city's northern corridor, a clean background record, no flags, the kind of profile that said nothing alarming and nothing interesting. The problem, Catherine had come to understand from long experience, was that profiles which said absolutely nothing were not the same as profiles that simply happened to be clean. The first kind was assembled. The second kind existed. Julian Cross's file looked assembled. On the return, she said nothing until they pulled up outside her building. Then, she opened her own door, something she almost never did, paused, and said quietly, "Thank you." Julian nodded. He did not offer anything in return. He received the words as adequate, not more, not less, and that was sufficient. The next morning, Grace reported that the transport firm had quietly declined all other client bookings for the remainder of the week. Every slot in their available calendar was empty, except for the schedule tied to Catherine's account. Someone had made that decision before the week began. The question of why Julian Cross unsettled her remained like a low-frequency sound she could not stop hearing. It was not simple discomfort. She had dealt with difficult men her entire career, men who challenged her with aggression, with condescension, with the polished sabotage that passed for professional disagreement. She understood all of those men. She knew where their weaknesses lived. Julian did not challenge her. He protected her, which was somehow harder to manage. Her father had built Vertex from a single regional logistics contract. When he died, the company had passed to Catherine at 26. The people who had promised him their loyalty spent the following 18 months maneuvering for what they could extract. She had fought all of it, and won in the ways that mattered, but she had buried something in the process. the part of her that believed other people were capable of the consistency she required. Trusting people, she had concluded, was not wisdom, it was exposure. On the third day, Ellie's aftercare arrangement fell through without warning. The backup arrangement fell through 40 minutes later. Julian said nothing about it until the third call ended, then told Catherine, in the same measured tone he used for traffic updates, that he would need to step away briefly in the late afternoon, unless a solution materialized. Catherine looked at him. She did not speak for a long moment. Then she told Grace to adjust the afternoon route to pass by the school before the 4 o'clock meeting. Ellie sat in the back seat with her Fox backpack in her lap, talking in a low and earnest voice about something that had happened at recess. Catherine found that it required almost nothing except stillness. The child did not need to be entertained. She simply existed in the car with a self-possession that had been developed rather than performed. At one point, Ellie looked directly at Catherine and said that her father had told her Catherine's job was very important. Catherine said carefully that it was. Ellie received this with the gravity of someone who had accepted the information and moved on. Later that evening, Catherine was crossing the underground garage when she heard a fragment of conversation. Julian was walking Ellie toward a different car, a pickup for the night, and the child's voice carried clearly in the concrete quiet. Ellie was asking whether this time her father was going to disappear like he had before. Julian's answer was quiet enough that Catherine caught only the opening word, but the pause before he spoke lasted long enough to carry its own weight. It was the pause of a man choosing words because the alternative was worse than silence. Catherine kept walking. She did not turn around, but she held on to that pause for longer than she intended. The week that followed was the kind that corporate histories do not record accurately. The official account would describe it as a period of market volatility and strategic repositioning. The actual experience of living through it was something closer to managed suffocation. Ryan Holloway arrived at Monday's leadership meeting with 4 memos outlining accelerating risk, a hostile acquisition inquiry, a debt covenant violation triggered by share price movement, a bank reconsidering its terms, and a media environment that had turned sharply negative following a string of stories sourced, as far as Catherine could determine, from inside her own organization. Ryan presented all of it with the gravity of a man performing reluctance while steering precisely where he intended to go. Catherine listened and watched his hands. They were very still. They were the hands of someone who was not surprised. Scarlett Vaughn's name appeared twice in the week's news cycle, once in connection with a report about Vertex's leadership instability, once in a financial column speculating that a friendly acquisition was in everyone's best interest. The column knew things that existed in no public filing. Julian from the wheel observed what no one inside the building was positioned to see. The leak pattern had a rhythm. Information reached the press within 3 to 4 hours of meetings where Ryan had been present. Scarlett's team seemed to anticipate schedule changes before they were confirmed, and the camera at the secondary parking entrance had been repositioned in the previous 2 weeks, angled away from the vehicle bay where Catherine's car was kept. He reported it to Grace without drama and told her to review the camera log. Catherine, meanwhile, was fighting on the front she could see. She counter-proposed, delayed, and demanded documentation that Ryan and Scarlett's representatives were slow to produce. She held the line in every room where the line could be held, but she was aware, with the bone-deep fatigue of someone who had been defending a position for too long, that holding a line was not the same as winning. The photograph appeared on a Thursday afternoon. It was a clear, well-composed image of Catherine stepping out of Julian's car, her hand on the doorframe, a brief exchange of eye contact between them visible through the glass. The headline attached to it suggested an undisclosed private meeting between Vertex's CEO and an unidentified outside advisor. The implication was left for the reader to assemble. The board received it before the business day ended. Julian looked at the photograph on his phone and went very still. He analyzed the angle, the focal depth, the position of the available light. He worked backward from the geometry. The image could only have come from the stairwell of the parking structure adjacent to the Vertex building. The stairwell required a keycard for access. He said, very quietly, that someone inside the building had taken it. Catherine turned on him. It was a cold pivot, the kind that came from someone who processed betrayal as information rather than wound. She said that since he had arrived, 2 tailing incidents had occurred. A photograph had been taken, and her board had been destabilized. She said that for all she knew, he had been sent to her by the same people who were trying to take her apart. Julian held her gaze. He did not defend himself. He said, "If I tell you who I am right now, you will not believe me." He told her part of it that evening. They were parked outside the Marchfield building after a late session that had run 3 hours over schedule. The city was fully dark, and the rain had started somewhere around 9. Julian had not turned on the engine when she returned to the car. He sat, and when she told him directly that the question was not optional, he answered. He said that before the driving work he had spent several years in executive protection and operational security, not personal protection in the bodyguard sense, but the kind of work that involved designing the architecture of how information moved, who it moved to, and where the vulnerabilities in those systems lived. He said he had left that world after a personal event he did not detail. He said the reason he did not advertise this background was that visibility created complications for him and for Ellie. Catherine listened without expression. She said, "That explains the route changes. It does not explain why you accepted a temporary driving position with a client whose schedule had already been leaked before you arrived." Julian looked at the rain on the windshield for a moment. "No," he said, "it does not." He left the gap unfilled. Not that night. What he had told her was true. What he had left out was the structure of it, the scale, the name, the reach. He had offered the shape of the silhouette without revealing what cast it. Catherine had met enough people who were carefully honest to know that careful honesty was not the same as simple honesty. Julian was being careful. She did not miss it. But something else had happened quietly, underneath the insufficiency of his disclosure. She had talked more than she intended about the 7 years since her father's death, the cost of building credibility in rooms where her presence was always provisional, the exhaustion of never being allowed to simply be wrong. It came out because the rain made the car feel separate from everything, and Julian listened in a way that made her feel, briefly, heard. He offered no sympathy and no reframing. He simply received what she said. Grace found the photograph 3 days later, older than the recent one, pulled from the archived files of a publication that no longer existed. It showed Julian at a private corporate event, positioned among people whose company implied serious institutional weight. The caption identified the other faces. The space beside Julian was labeled only with initials. The initials matched. Grace placed it on Catherine's desk without commentary. Catherine stood in the elevator that evening, the photograph on her phone, staring at the man she had spent a week arguing with, deferring to against her preference, and once in the unguarded dark of a parked car, in the rain, trusting with a part of herself, she kept very carefully guarded. She still did not know who he actually was, but she knew that the gap between what he had said and what the photograph implied was not small. She confronted him the next morning in the parking structure before either of them had spoken to anyone else. She was not raised and she was not emotional. Catherine Bennett was neither of those things. She held the photograph out, and she stood back, and she waited. Julian looked at the image. Then he looked at her. "I know what you are going to ask," he said. "Then answer it." The silence that followed was not evasive. It was the silence of a man measuring what it was going to cost him to say something out loud that he had kept internal for years. Catherine recognized it. She had spent years in exactly that kind of silence herself, weighing disclosure against exposure, and understanding that sometimes the two were the same thing. "My full name," he said, "is Julian Mercer Cross. Before I left the sector, I co-founded a firm called Atlas Shield. We built executive security infrastructure, risk modeling, logistics intelligence, threat assessment at the corporate scale. At its peak, Atlas operated in 14 countries and ran a financial arm involved in acquisition defense for distressed companies." He paused. Catherine said nothing. "When my wife died," he continued, in a voice that had flattened nearly to nothing, "it was directly connected to a route leak. Her schedule had been passed to the wrong person. I had built the systems designed to prevent exactly that, and they had not prevented it. After that, I dissolved my public role, restructured my assets into a trust under a different name, and removed Ellie from any association with the Atlas name or the Mercer Cross name. I have not used either professionally since. Catherine heard all of it. She stood with her back against the concrete pillar, and she heard every word, and also the words beneath them about a man who had built the architecture of safety for other people and had not been able to protect the one where it mattered most. She understood the shape of that grief, if not its specific form, the way it hardened into methodology, into cold precision, into someone who had stopped trusting outcomes they could not control. She asked why he had taken the job. He had money. He had options. He had clear and documented reasons to stay away from exactly this kind of situation. So why her? Why now? He said, because the pattern around you is the same pattern. Same timing, same type of source, same escalation toward the personal. When I saw it, I could not walk past it. Catherine looked at him for a long time. Then she said with great precision, I need you to finish the week. After that, I would like you to stop. Julian said, all right. He said it without argument, without appeal. He accepted it the way he accepted most things, with a completeness that left no space for negotiation. He also said, before she turned toward the elevator, whoever is running the inside operation is moving to the next phase. This week will not only be press, be careful with your board documents. That evening, Catherine received a call from a number that returned no traceable information. The voice was male and flat, in the synthetic way of someone distorting deliberately. It told her that she had 48 hours to authorize the acquisition agreement, or the surveillance of her movements would be redirected to someone smaller and less equipped to protect herself. The call lasted 11 seconds. She replayed it 4 times. Then she set the phone face down on the desk and sat in the silence of a very well-appointed penthouse that felt, for the first time, genuinely small. She called Julian at 11:17 that night. The call went to voicemail brief. No name, only a callback number. She sat by the window and watched the city below, and thought about what it meant that the most useful thing she could do in the worst moment she had faced in years was to call a man she had told to stop coming to work. The board meeting was scheduled for Thursday. Ryan had framed the agenda as an emergency governance session, the kind of language that meant, in board parlance, the outcome had already been decided, and the meeting was the ceremony. Scarlett's acquisition group had submitted a formal offer the previous afternoon, timed precisely to when the leaked photograph would be freshest in every board member's memory. The offer was structured to appear generous. It would eliminate Vertex's debt, stabilize the share price, and guarantee employment for 12 months. 12 months was enough time for Scarlett's team to strip the company to its most profitable components and discard everything else: the regional networks, the smaller operators, the people who had built the foundation and had no leverage once the name on the door changed. She called Julian again at 6:45 in the morning. He answered on the second ring. She told him about the anonymous call, about the board meeting, and with considerably more difficulty that she had been wrong to send him away. She needed to understand the full extent of what he knew. Julian was quiet for a moment. Then he said he needed 2 hours, and that she should not go to the building until he called her back. She almost said something about not taking direction from people she had dismissed. She stopped herself. She had spent a week watching Julian be correct about things before she was, and she was running out of room to prioritize her pride above her survival. Grace had spent the night pulling thread after thread from the company's internal data. She had cross-referenced document access times against Ryan's calendar, traced the timing of press leaks against internal distribution lists, and compiled a pattern so consistent it had ceased being coincidence. She brought it to Catherine's building at 7:30 in a folder printed on a personal device in cash-bought hardware. Catherine read through it without a word. Ryan Holloway was the node. Every leak passed through systems he controlled. Every external pressure escalation followed meetings he attended. The financial structure of Scarlett's acquisition bid contained terms impossible to construct without detailed knowledge of Vertex's internal debt covenants documents that lived in Ryan's filing authority. He had not acted alone, and the operation had been running for 8 months. Catherine set the folder down and looked at the skyline. She had been so focused on not trusting people from outside that she had failed to protect herself from within. The systems had been subverted by a man she had trusted because his credentials were clean and his composure was reliable. The envelope arrived at 8 a.m., placed at her door by a courier no one had called. It contained a single printed page, a copy of the convertible debt instrument that Vertex's holding bank had transferred in a quiet secondary transaction 18 months earlier. Catherine read to the bottom of the page. The ultimate holder of the note, as amended through the Mercer Cross Trust, was recorded at the bottom with a signature she had not seen before. Julian had not simply been beside her for a week. For 18 months, without announcement and without approach, he had held the instrument that could save her company or end it. She had been sending him away. The hand holding the page went very still. The boardroom occupied the 43rd floor. By 9:15, it held 10 board members, 2 attorneys, Ryan Holloway, and Scarlett Vaughn, who sat at the far end with the stillness of someone who expected the morning to go according to plan. Catherine entered at 9:18, sat at her end, and said nothing. Ryan watched her with the measured attention of a man timing his move. The board chair called the session to order. The agenda was framed as a vote on whether to authorize executive management to enter exclusivity negotiations on the acquisition offer. It was phrased carefully enough to sound procedural. Everyone in the room understood it was a vote on whether Catherine still ran her own company. Ryan began to speak. He spoke well, as he always had, laying out the financial picture with sorrowful precision, citing the debt covenant, the share price pressure, the reputational risk. 2 board members were nodding before he finished. Then the door opened. Julian Cross walked into the boardroom in a charcoal suit that fit the way expensive clothes fit people who have worn them long enough to forget the price. He moved to the near end of the table and placed a bound document in front of the board chair. He did not introduce himself. He did not need to. One board member who had spent 30 years in institutional finance went very still. A second straightened in his chair. The attorney beside Ryan set down his pen. Julian was recognized before he said a word. "My name is Julian Mercer Cross," he said. "I am the beneficial holder of the Mercer Cross Trust, which currently holds the convertible debt instrument on Vertex Transit Technologies. I am here to exercise a right of clarification under the terms of that instrument before this board proceeds to any vote." Ryan's expression did not change. Scarlett shifted by the smallest possible margin, a compression around the eyes that was the closest she came to surprise. Julian opened the second document. On the table, he placed the camera logs from the secondary parking entrance, annotated with timestamps. He placed a record of internal document access times, cross-referenced against Ryan's system logins. He placed a summary of financial communications between a shell advisory entity and Scarlett Vaughn's acquisition vehicle, tracing the construction of the bid terms against non-public covenant information that had no legitimate path to the outside. He walked the board through it in 8 minutes. He did not editorialize. He did not perform. He laid the architecture of what had been done on a table in front of the people who had been allowing it to proceed without knowing. Ryan's counsel requested a recess. Ryan did not return from it. Julian turned briefly and looked at Catherine. Not as a driver, not as a protector, not as a man with leverage. He looked at her the way a person looks at someone whose position they understand from the inside. He said, "I did not come here to exercise the convertible note. I came here because this board needed to know what it was actually deciding. And I came here to say on the record that the company worth protecting in this room is the one led by the person at that end of the table. Not because the financials are clean, because in the worst week of her tenure, with every system around her compromised, she did not sell a single one of her people out to buy herself more time." He set his copy of the document down. I thought that was worth saying before anyone voted. The room was very quiet. Scarlett withdrew her offer formally before the session ended, with a brevity that said she had already moved on to her next calculation. The board chair called for a short recess. The attorneys began speaking in low, careful tones. Catherine looked at Julian and said, clearly and without softness, "If you want to remain in this room, it will be on my terms." What followed the board session would be described, in the investor communication drafted 2 weeks later, as a decisive governance clarification, leading to an authorized restructuring under new strategic terms. That language was accurate enough. It did not describe what it felt like to be in the room when it happened. Catherine set out her conditions with the same economy Julian used when discussing routes. She would accept a capital intervention from the Mercer Cross Trust at the original convertible instrument terms. No accelerated renegotiation. No headcount reduction in the first 24 months. No arrangement licensing client data to third parties. No governance structure placing operational veto authority in any outside principal's hands. Julian listened to all of it. Then he agreed to all of it, without negotiation. The board observed this exchange with the attentiveness of people recalibrating something fundamental. They had come in expecting to watch a CEO managed out of her own company. They had watched her instead set the conditions under which the most consequential private investor in the room would participate in the company's future, and watched him accept those conditions without pause. After the room cleared, Catherine and Julian stood at the far end of the long table. The documents from the morning were still spread across the surface between them. Through the glass behind him, the city continued exactly as it always did. She said, "You held that note for 18 months. Yes, there were 3 moments in the past year where the covenant breach would have given you full conversion rights. You could have moved at any of them. Yes. Why didn't you?" Julian was quiet for a moment. "Because I was not certain you were worth protecting." She looked at him. "And now?" she said. "Now I am certain." It was not a romantic declaration. It was something older and harder, the judgment of someone who had learned at significant personal cost to trust his own assessments, and who was willing to state out loud that his assessment had changed. Catherine said, "The thing I am angry about is not the name, or the trust, or the history." She paused. "I am angry because you allowed me to trust you before I knew who I was trusting, and then I had to find out the hard way." Julian said, "I know." He did not attempt to argue around it. He said, "The only way I understood how to keep Ellie safe was to keep everything small and off the record. I have been doing it long enough that I forgot it requires other people to extend trust on a basis that is not fair to them." He said, "I am sorry for that." Catherine had received many apologies in her career. Most of them had been performances of regret designed to reset a negotiation. This one was not that. She received it in the same stillness in which it was offered. Then she asked him whether Ellie liked pancakes for dinner. Julian looked at her for a moment. The first time in all of it, that something in his face moved unmistakably in the direction of warmth, without being managed or compressed away. "She does," he said. "Then fix your schedule," Catherine said, and walked toward the elevator. The weeks that followed did not move at the speed of resolution. Real things rarely did. The restructuring took time to formalize. Julian's involvement was documented and disclosed in terms that the respective attorneys negotiated with considerable precision, establishing the scope of the strategic advisory arrangement, while ensuring Ellie's name appeared in no public filing and no media summary. Ryan's departure was handled through legal channels and communicated externally in language that was accurate without being complete. Scarlett Vaughn moved on, as she always did, to a new target in a different sector, and the trade press found other things to misread. Catherine ran a better meeting on the first Tuesday after the board session than she had in months. Grace noticed. She said nothing about it, but she adjusted the day's schedule, with a fraction more breathing room between appointments, as if she had understood that her employer no longer needed to be in a state of continuous siege in order to function at her best. Julian came to the building one evening near the end of that month to review the security architecture with the new operations team Catherine had brought in to replace the compromised elements of the old one. He sat in a conference room on the 14th floor and answered questions for 2 hours, with the quiet authority of someone who had been doing this work since before most of the people in the room had finished school. When it was over and the room had cleared, Catherine appeared in the doorway. Ellie was with him. She sat at the end of the long table with her Fox backpack and a workbook, applying herself to a list of spelling words with great deliberateness. Julian sat beside her, one hand on the table, watching her work. Catherine came in and sat 2 chairs down. She looked at what Ellie was working on, each word checked carefully against a reference card positioned at the top of the page. "She has a test tomorrow," Julian said. "Does she need someone to quiz her?" Ellie looked up from the workbook with the direct and evaluating gaze that was entirely her father's. She considered the offer for a moment, then slid the reference card across the table. Catherine took it. The 3 of them sat in the quiet of the conference room, as the city outside continued doing what it always did, and the work went forward in the particular rhythm of people who have stopped pretending they do not need each other. Catherine had hired Julian Cross as a temporary solution to a temporary problem. She had expected a driver and received instead a reckoning with the nature of trust, the architecture of betrayal, and the question of what it meant to stand at the top of something and still feel entirely alone. What she had not expected, and what she had not been prepared for, was the discovery that the man she had placed in the lowest position in her orbit had chosen for reasons she was only beginning to understand to protect not just her company and her safety, but the part of her she had spent years building walls around. She had thought she was hiring a driver for a week. She had found someone worth a great deal longer than that,